The air in the cave was cool and smelled of salt and damp stone, a stark contrast to the harsh afternoon sun baking the bluffs of Cape Hatteras outside. 10-year-old Luke Williams knelt on the sandy floor, his small hands trembling as he pried open the lid of a sealed plastic box he had found tucked away on a high ledge. Inside, nestled amongst dried seaweed and shells, were photographs of a smiling boy who looked just like him and a single yellowed letter folded with care. As he unfolded the paper, his eyes scanned the handwritten words, each sentence a testament to a kind of love he had only ever dreamed of. His legs suddenly felt weak, unable to support the weight of his discovery, and he sank onto the ground. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart for 3 long years finally crumbled, and for the first time since his parents were gone, Luke allowed himself to cry, the silent sobs echoing in the secret, forgotten laboratory. This single moment of release, a quiet collapse in a hidden sanctuary, would become the turning point of his entire life. We are so grateful that you are here to witness the beginning of his transformation with us. Every story we share is a journey, and knowing you are listening alongside us makes it all the more meaningful. If this story is already starting to resonate with you, please let us know where you are listening from in the comments section below. Your engagement helps our community grow and allows these narratives to find the people who need to hear them. Be sure to leave a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss a single step of Luke's incredible path forward. Your support is the energy that allows us to continue telling stories that matter, and for that, we are truly thankful. But to understand the immense power held within that piece of paper, to grasp why a hidden marine observatory became the only safe harbor for a runaway boy, we must go back. We need to travel 3 days into the past, to a sweltering Sunday morning 53 miles away in the bustling tourist town of Nag's Head. It was there, behind a noisy beach shack filled with the scent of sunscreen and fried food, that a whispered conversation not meant for his ears sealed his fate. The story of how Luke found himself in that cave doesn't begin with a discovery of hope, but with the chilling certainty that he had to escape. To comprehend his tears of relief, we must first witness the quiet desperation that drove him to run for his life, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a handful of crumpled dollars. 3 days before he found the cave, Luke Williams was just a 10-year-old boy trying to make himself as small as possible, in a world that had become too large and too loud. For 3 years, ever since the boating accident that had claimed both his parents, he had lived in Nag's Head, North Carolina, under the reluctant care of his Uncle Roger and Aunt Simone. The transition had been jarring, a brutal shift from a life filled with warmth and encouragement to one defined by a cold, unspoken agreement that he was a problem to be managed. His existence was confined to the periphery of their lives, a shadow moving between their small, cluttered house and the sun-bleached planks of the family's beach shack, a place where he was more of an asset than a nephew, more of a tool than a child. His world had shrunk, and the vastness of the Atlantic Ocean just steps away only served to remind him of how trapped he truly was. His bedroom was not a room at all, but a worn-out hammock strung across the humid, screened-in service porch at the back of the house. This was his space, a narrow corridor that smelled of damp towels, chlorine, and the faint, greasy aroma from the kitchen's exhaust fan. At night, he would lie there, listening to the rhythmic hum of the air conditioning unit and the distant laughter from his cousin's bedroom, a place with a real bed, a desk, and posters on the walls. Luke had none of that. His few possessions, a change of clothes and a worn paperback, were kept in a plastic bin tucked under a utility sink. This physical separation was a constant, tangible reminder of his status in the home. He was an outsider living within its walls, close enough to serve their needs but far enough to be forgotten as soon as the back door was closed. Every morning his day began before the sun had a chance to burn off the coastal fog. By 8 o'clock, he was already at the beach shack, his bare feet sinking into the cool, damp sand. His job was labor, pure and simple, a 10-hour shift of relentless physical work under the unforgiving Carolina sun. He was responsible for hauling the heavy wooden lounge chairs and wide, cumbersome umbrellas from the storage shed to the shoreline, arranging them in neat, straight rows for the tourists who would soon arrive. He lugged heavy coolers filled with ice and sodas, his small frame straining under the weight. The work was repetitive and exhausting, a cycle of lifting, carrying, and digging into the sand that left his muscles aching and his skin raw, a daily penance for a debt he never asked for and could never seem to repay. The injustice of his situation was made painfully clear by the presence of his cousin, a boy his exact same age, who spent his days in the cool shade of the shack's awning. While Luke toiled on the hot sand, his cousin managed the cash register, a simple task that involved exchanging cold drinks for crumpled bills. He would complain about the boredom or the heat, oblivious to the sweat dripping from Luke's face just a few yards away. Roger and Simone would bring their son cold lemonades and snacks, ruffling his hair with affectionate pride. Luke, on the other hand, was offered only water from a communal jug and the occasional sharp command to work faster. This stark contrast was a daily lesson in his own worthlessness, a clear and silent message that he was not, and would never be, part of their real family. His uncle's justification for this arrangement was a phrase that echoed in Luke's mind, a constant and cruel refrain. He was simply earning his keep. Roger would say it with a dismissive wave of his hand whenever a tourist would comment on how hard the boy was working, or on the rare occasion Luke looked too exhausted to continue. The words were a shield, deflecting any potential criticism and reinforcing the narrative that Luke's labor was a fair exchange for the roof over his head and the meager food he was given. To Roger, it was a simple business transaction. But for Luke, those words were a heavy chain, binding him to a life of servitude and stripping him of any right to complain, to rest, or to simply be a child. He was not being cared for. He was paying off a debt for the crime of being orphaned. In the face of this daily hardship, Luke had learned that silence was his only shield. He had become an expert observer, a quiet presence who noticed everything but said nothing. He watched the patterns of the tides, the way the sandpipers skittered along the water's edge, and the changing colors of the sky at sunset. He committed to memory the faces of the regular tourists, learning to anticipate their needs before they even asked. This quiet watchfulness was his form of rebellion, a way to maintain a small private piece of himself that his uncle couldn't touch or monetize. He retreated into his own mind, a silent world filled with the fading memories of his parents' laughter and the stories they used to tell him about the ocean, a place they had loved and had taught him to love as well. The physical toll of his labor was etched onto his 10-year-old body. His hands, which should have been soft, were rough and calloused from gripping the splintered wood of the beach chairs. A permanent line of sunburn marked the back of his neck, a testament to the long hours spent with his head bowed under the sun. At the end of each day, a deep, weary ache settled into his bones, a profound exhaustion that sleep could never fully erase. He would collapse into his hammock on the service porch, the gentle swaying doing little to soothe his sore muscles. He would lie there in the darkness, too tired to dream, his body preparing for the inevitable moment when the sun would rise and the entire grueling cycle would begin all over again. While his uncle was the source of the explicit cruelty, his Aunt Simone's contribution was a quiet, corrosive indifference. She rarely spoke to him directly, her eyes sliding past him as if he were a piece of furniture. She was the one who ensured his cousin always had the newest video games and brand-name clothes, while Luke wore faded hand-me-downs that were always slightly too big or too small. Her complicity was a different kind of pain. It was the pain of being invisible, of having his needs and his very existence completely ignored by the woman who was supposed to be his maternal figure. Her silence was an endorsement of Roger's cruelty, a quiet confirmation that in her eyes he simply did not matter enough to protect or even to acknowledge. He watched as hundreds of dollars passed through his cousin's hands each day at the cash register, a river of money that flowed directly into his uncle's pocket. Luke understood its power. He saw how it bought his cousin's happiness and his aunt's affection, yet not a single dollar was ever offered to him. The occasional tip left by a sympathetic tourist would be immediately confiscated by Roger, who claimed it as part of the shack's earnings. This constant proximity to wealth, coupled with his own enforced poverty, taught him a bitter lesson about his place in the world. He was not a person who earned money. He was a resource from which money was extracted, as impersonal and expendable as the ice melting in the coolers he carried. Lately, a new tension had settled over the small house, a subtle shift in the oppressive atmosphere that Luke could feel but not yet understand. Uncle Roger had been spending more time on the phone, his voice low and agitated as he paced the length of the kitchen. A few times, Luke had caught snippets of the conversations, stray words and phrases that meant nothing on their own but felt significant. He heard the name of a town, Cape Hatteras, mentioned more than once, and the phrase $150 repeated with a frustrated edge. He didn't know what it meant, but he recognized the familiar tone of a business deal in his uncle's voice, and a cold knot of anxiety began to form in the pit of his stomach, a premonition that whatever was being discussed would not be good for him. That final weekend before his escape was the peak of the summer season, and the beach was a chaotic sea of people. The workload intensified, and Roger's temper grew shorter with each passing hour. The demands were relentless, the sun was hotter, and Luke felt his already limited energy draining away faster than usual. The air was thick with the smell of sunscreen and fried food, but also with a sense of impending change. The hushed phone calls had stopped, and now a tense, expectant silence had fallen between his aunt and uncle. They exchanged knowing glances over his head, looks that communicated a shared secret he was not meant to understand. Something was about to happen. He could feel it in the strained quiet of the house and the sharp, impatient tone of his uncle's commands. For 3 long years this life had been his normal. He had almost forgotten the feeling of being wanted, the simple security of knowing he was loved. His world had become a predictable loop of labor and exhaustion, a reality where his only purpose was to serve the needs of the family that had taken him in but never truly accepted him. He had adapted, survived, and learned to exist within the narrow confines of his role. But the foundation of that fragile stability was beginning to crack. The normalized suffering he had endured day after day was about to be replaced by a new and terrifying threat, a change that would force him to confront the grim reality that his situation could, and was about to, get much, much worse. The moment that shattered his world arrived not with a shout, but with a low conspiratorial murmur. It happened on that sweltering Sunday morning, while Luke was stacking a new delivery of umbrellas behind the relative quiet of the beach shack. He was hidden from view, shielded by a canvas wall that separated the storage area from the small, cramped office where his uncle took his calls. He heard the click of the phone and then Roger's voice, smoother and more persuasive than the gruff tone he used for commands. Luke froze, his hand still gripping the rough fabric of an umbrella. His uncle was talking to someone, a man, and the words he was using were the same ones he used when negotiating with vendors, the language of a transaction. A cold dread, sharp and immediate, pierced through the oppressive heat of the day, telling him that this was not a normal business call. He pressed his ear closer to the thin wall, the canvas rough against his skin, and the details of the arrangement began to crystallize into a terrifyingly clear picture. Roger was describing him, not as a person but as a product. He spoke of Luke's strength, his obedience, his willingness to work long hours without complaint. The man on the other end of the line was apparently the owner of a guest house in Cape Hatteras. The deal was simple. Luke would be sent there to work, a permanent transfer. In exchange, Roger would receive a payment of $150 every month sent directly to him. The money wasn't for Luke, it was the price of his removal. He was being traded, sold for a sum that reduced his entire existence to a small recurring profit for the man who was supposed to be his guardian. The conversation continued, each word a hammer blow against Luke's fragile sense of self. His uncle assured the guest house owner that the boy required very little. He would be housed in a small storage room behind the main building, a place with no window and just enough space for a cot. For food, he could eat the leftovers from the guests' plates, so he wouldn't be an additional expense. Luke's stomach churned as he listened. The hammock on the service porch, which he had always seen as a symbol of his exclusion, suddenly seemed like a luxury. He was about to lose even that meager comfort, to be relegated to a life of scraps and darkness, even more isolated and invisible than he was now. The casual cruelty in his uncle's description of his future was breathtaking. It was a plan for disposal, not for care. The most devastating part of the conversation came at the very end. After confirming the details of the first payment, Roger let out a short, satisfied laugh. Luke heard him say that it was a perfect arrangement for everyone involved. He would finally get the boy out of the house, leaving it free for his real family, and he'd even make a little extra cash on the side. That single phrase, real family, sliced through Luke more deeply than any physical blow ever could. It was the explicit confirmation of everything he had felt for 3 years, that he was an intruder, a temporary problem, a foreign object in their home. In that moment he understood that he was not an unloved nephew or a difficult orphan. He was simply a burden his uncle had finally found a profitable way to discard. The click of the phone ending the call was deafening in the sudden silence. Luke remained frozen behind the wall of umbrellas, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The familiar sounds of the beach, the waves, the distant laughter, the cry of gulls, all faded into a dull, meaningless roar. He was no longer just a boy forced to work. He was a piece of property that had just been sold. The years of quiet suffering, of earning his keep, had not been a path toward acceptance. They had been a trial period, a demonstration of his value as a laborer before being sold to the highest bidder. There was no one to turn to, no one to tell. His Aunt Simone's indifference was now cast in a new, more sinister light. She was not just ignoring him, she was complicit in his erasure. He realized with chilling certainty that there was no room for negotiation or appeal. The deal was done. The casual, triumphant tone in his uncle's voice made it clear that this was a final decision. He was a problem that had been solved. The vague anxiety he had felt over the past few weeks, the tension in the house, the hushed phone calls, it all snapped into focus. This had been the plan all along. He was an asset to be liquidated. The illusion that he was part of any kind of family, however dysfunctional, was completely shattered. He was utterly and completely alone, trapped in a reality where the adults who were legally responsible for his protection were the very ones orchestrating his enslavement for a handful of dollars. A new kind of fear, cold and sharp, began to spread through him. It was the fear of imminence. His uncle hadn't specified a date, but the finality of the call suggested it would be soon, perhaps tomorrow or the next day. Every moment he remained here was a moment closer to being shipped off to Cape Hatteras, to that windowless room, and a life of servitude from which there would be no escape. The beach shack, a place of relentless toil, suddenly transformed into a ticking clock. The sun beating down on his back was no longer just a source of discomfort. It was a countdown timer, marking the final hours of his limited, fragile freedom. He had to act. He had to do something now before his uncle came looking for him, before the car arrived to take him away. The vague notion of running away, a fantasy he had entertained on his most desperate nights, was no longer a dream. It was a necessity, the only logical response to an impossible situation. Staying meant accepting his fate, allowing himself to be packaged and delivered like an object. He thought of his parents, of the love they had shown him, of the way they had taught him to be curious and kind. He could not honor their memory by surrendering to this. The injustice was too great, the betrayal too profound. The foundation of his world had been ripped away, leaving him standing on the edge of a terrifying precipice. He was not just running from hardship, he was running toward the faint, flickering hope that he was worth more than $150 a month. In that single, overheard conversation, the nature of his reality had irrevocably changed. The chronic, grinding misery of his daily life was replaced by an acute and immediate threat. The rules of survival had shifted. It was no longer about enduring the present, it was about escaping the future. The quiet, observant boy who had learned to make himself invisible had to find a way to disappear completely. The point of no return had been crossed, not by his own choice, but by the casual cruelty of a man who saw him not as a child, but as a commodity. The time for silent suffering was over. The time to run had begun. The world behind the wall of umbrellas dissolved into a muted, meaningless hum. Luke's mind, which moments before had been a whirlwind of fear and shock, became startlingly, terrifyingly clear. There was no room for tears, no time for the suffocating weight of grief. There was only the cold, hard certainty of a single undeniable truth. He had to run. The decision was not a choice, but a biological imperative, like breathing or blinking. Staying was not an option, it was a sentence. Every instinct in his 10-year-old body screamed at him to flee, to put as much distance as possible between himself and the man who had just sold his future for pocket money. The casual cruelty of the phrase "real family" echoed in his head, severing the last frayed thread of hope that things might one day get better. He understood now that he was not waiting for a rescue. He was his own rescuer, and the escape had to begin this very instant. His mind, sharpened by years of silent observation, began to work with a frantic, desperate efficiency. He had no map, no allies, and no destination beyond the vague name he had overheard: Cape Hatteras. It was a place on a map, 53 miles away, and that was enough. His plan formed in fragments, a mosaic of survival instincts. First, he had to get away from the shack without being seen. The beach was his only advantage, a chaotic river of tourists that could provide camouflage. He would walk, not run, blending into the crowd until he was far enough away to be just another anonymous child on the sand. He pictured the route in his head, a straight line along the shoreline moving south, away from the pier and the cluster of businesses his uncle frequented. He would become a ghost, a whisper of movement against the backdrop of the summer crowd, disappearing before anyone even noticed he was gone. His hand instinctively went to his pocket, closing around the small, crumpled wad of bills and coins he had painstakingly saved. It amounted to just over $20, a collection of forgotten change from tourists and the occasional dollar bill pressed into his hand when his uncle wasn't looking. He had kept it hidden, tucked away in a small tear in the lining of his shorts, a secret treasure for a day he never truly believed would come. Now that small, insignificant sum was his entire world. It was a bus ticket. It was a bottle of water. It was the key to unlocking the first stage of his freedom. The weight of the coins felt heavy, a tangible representation of his only resource in a world that had stripped him of everything else. This money was not a gift. It was earned, drop by drop, in sweat and silence, and he would use it to buy his life back. The oppressive afternoon sun became a relentless clock, its heat pressing down on him, urging him to move. Every minute he remained hidden behind the umbrellas was a minute closer to discovery. He listened intently, his ears straining to catch the sound of his uncle's footsteps or the creak of the office door. Soon the lunch rush would slow, and Roger would emerge to bark new orders. His absence would be noted, questions would be asked, and his small window of opportunity would slam shut. The thought of being caught, of the smug look on his uncle's face as he was dragged away to his new life in Cape Hatteras, was a spur of terror that overrode all other fears. He could not afford to hesitate. The time for planning was over almost as soon as it began. The time for action was now, within the next few precious, fleeting minutes. A wave of dizziness washed over him, the sheer terror of what he was about to do threatening to paralyze him. He was a 10-year-old boy about to walk into the unknown with nothing but the clothes on his back and a handful of change. For a fleeting second, the image of his parents flashed in his mind, their warm smiles, the feeling of his father's hand on his shoulder. The urge to curl up and wait for them, to believe in an impossible rescue, was overwhelming. But he pushed it down, burying it deep inside. That life was gone. The boy who was loved and protected was gone. In his place was a survivor, a creature honed by 3 years of neglect and hardship. He took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing the cold resolve back into his veins. He would not be a victim. He would not be a commodity. He would be free. Peeking through a tiny gap between 2 stacked umbrellas, he scanned the area. He could see his cousin sitting lazily behind the cash register, scrolling on a phone. His aunt was nowhere in sight. His uncle, he knew, was still in the small office, likely counting the morning's earnings. The path to the crowded part of the beach was clear for a stretch of about 30 feet. It was an open, vulnerable space. He would have to walk it calmly, his posture relaxed, as if he were simply heading to the shoreline to adjust a chair. He watched the patterns of the tourists, the ebb and flow of families walking to and from the water. He needed to time his emergence perfectly, inserting himself into a group, becoming just another face in the sea of strangers. His heart hammered against his ribs, each beat a drum, counting down to the moment of execution. The sharp, metallic scrape of a chair leg on the wooden floor of the office jolted him into action. That was the sound, that was the signal. His uncle was getting up. In seconds, the door would open, and his chance would be gone. There was no more time for thought, no more room for doubt. It was now or never. All the fear, all the planning, all the emotional fortification of the last few minutes coalesced into a single, sharp point of focus. He pulled his worn baseball cap down low over his eyes, a flimsy disguise that made him feel slightly more invisible. He took one last, steadying breath, the air thick with the smell of salt and sunscreen, a scent he would forever associate with this single, life-altering moment. His entire being was coiled, a spring of desperate energy ready to be released. He made a silent promise to himself, a vow forged in the heat and the fear. He would not look back. He would not falter. When he stepped out from behind the umbrellas, he would keep walking, one foot in front of the other, until the beach shack and the life it represented were nothing more than a distant memory. The image of the windowless room in Cape Hatteras burned in his mind, a powerful fuel for his resolve. He was not running away from something. He was running toward the possibility of anything else, a future where he was more than a line item in his uncle's ledger. With that final, clarifying thought, he pushed aside the canvas flap of the umbrella and prepared to take the first deliberate step into the blinding sunlight and the complete uncertainty of his new life. He stepped out from behind the wall of umbrellas, a single fluid motion born of pure adrenaline. The world exploded in a cacophony of sound and light. The sun was a physical weight, blindingly bright, and the air was thick with the shouts of children, the distant thrum of music from a portable speaker, and the rhythmic crash of waves against the shore. He forced his legs to move, his bare feet sinking into the hot, loose sand. He fell into step behind a family carrying inflatable toys, using their slow, ambling pace as a shield. His heart was a frantic bird beating against his ribs, but on the outside he was just another boy walking toward the water. He kept his head down, the bill of his cap shadowing his face, focusing only on the sand in front of him, one deliberate step after another, moving away from the shack that had been his prison. The beach shack, with its faded blue paint and the grease-stained sign, began to shrink behind him. He walked for what felt like an eternity, the shoreline stretching out in an endless ribbon of white sand and churning foam. He did not dare to look back, terrified of seeing his uncle's silhouette emerge from the shack, a hand raised to his eyes, scanning the crowd. Instead, he focused on the horizon, a blurry line where the blue of the ocean met the pale blue of the sky. The sheer vastness of it all was both a comfort and a source of terror. It was big enough to hide in, but also big enough to be completely lost within. He kept walking south, a small, determined figure against the immense backdrop of the Atlantic, each step a quiet act of rebellion, a severing of the ties that had bound him for so long. A sudden spike of fear, cold and sharp, shot through him. High above the beach, perched in a tall white chair, a lifeguard had raised a pair of binoculars to his eyes, slowly scanning the water and the shoreline. Luke's breath caught in his throat. He imagined the lifeguard's gaze sweeping over the crowd, pausing on him, a lone boy walking with too much purpose. He immediately veered toward a large family, spreading out a colorful blanket, dropping to his knees as if he had spotted a fascinating seashell. He picked up a smooth, gray stone, turning it over and over in his palm, his back to the lifeguard stand. He stayed there, frozen in his feigned discovery, until he dared to peek over his shoulder and saw the binoculars were now pointed far out to sea. He let out a shaky breath and scrambled back to his feet, resuming his determined march. After nearly an hour of walking, the dense crowds of tourists began to thin. The beach became quieter, more desolate, and he felt his anonymity slipping away. He was more exposed now, a solitary figure on the wide expanse of sand. He knew he couldn't stay on the beach forever. He had to find the main road, the coastal highway that would lead him to a bus stop. He scrambled up a sandy dune, his feet slipping, and emerged into a sprawling public parking lot. The transition was jarring. The soft, yielding sand was replaced by scorching black asphalt that burned the soles of his feet. The air, no longer cooled by the ocean breeze, was stagnant and thick with the smell of hot tar and exhaust fumes. He was in a different world now, a harsher, more industrial landscape that offered no place to hide. He began walking along the shoulder of the highway, the roar of passing cars a constant, deafening presence. Trucks thundered by, shaking the ground and sending gusts of hot air into his face. He felt incredibly small and vulnerable, a tiny speck of humanity against the relentless flow of traffic. He kept his eyes fixed on the roadside, searching for the familiar blue and white sign that marked a bus route. The sun was relentless, beating down on his head and neck, and a desperate thirst began to parch his throat. He clutched the crumpled $20 in his pocket, the small wad of bills a fragile promise of escape. He ignored his growing discomfort, his focus narrowed to a single desperate task, finding the stop that would take him to Cape Hatteras, the only destination he knew. Finally, he saw it. Ahead, just past a weathered billboard advertising saltwater taffy, was a simple wooden bench and a metal pole with a faded bus schedule attached. It was unassuming, almost invisible against the blur of the highway, but to Luke, it was a beacon of hope. Relief, so potent it almost buckled his knees, washed over him. He had made it. He quickly walked to the bench and sat down, trying to appear as if he belonged there, as if he were just a local kid waiting for a ride. The new anxiety was immediate and sharp. How long would he have to wait? Would the bus driver question a 10-year-old traveling alone? He pulled the money from his pocket, smoothing the crumpled bills against his thigh, rehearsing the words he would need to say. The wait was agonizing. Each minute stretched into an eternity, filled with the terrifying possibility of discovery. Every slow-moving car that approached sent a jolt of panic through him. He imagined his uncle's truck pulling over, the door flying open, his brief dream of freedom ending in a furious shout. He made himself as inconspicuous as possible, pulling his knees up to his chest and staring intently at the cracked pavement at his feet. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the highway. He was alone, exposed, a sitting target. The initial adrenaline of his escape had faded, replaced by a deep gnawing fear and the profound weight of his solitude. He was just a boy on a bench, waiting for a bus that felt like it might never come. Then in the distance he saw it, a large lumbering shape shimmering in the heat haze. As it grew closer, he could make out the distinct form of an intercity bus. Its air brakes hissed loudly as it slowed, pulling onto the gravel shoulder in front of him. The sound was the most beautiful thing he had ever heard. The doors folded open with a pneumatic sigh, revealing a set of steep steps leading up into the cool, dark interior. For a heartbeat, he was paralyzed, caught between the world he was leaving and the complete unknown he was about to enter. This was it. This was the final, irreversible step. He pushed himself off the bench, his legs feeling stiff and unsteady, and climbed aboard, leaving the heat and the fear of the highway behind him. He stood before the driver, a large man with a tired expression who seemed to look straight through him. Luke's voice was a dry, raspy whisper when he spoke the words he had practiced in his mind. "1 ticket to Cape Hatteras, please." He carefully unfolded his small collection of bills and coins, his hands trembling so badly he almost dropped them. He placed the money on the tray, watching as the driver counted it with an air of detached boredom. The man grunted, pushed a few buttons on his console, and a small paper ticket printed out with a whirring sound. He tore it off and handed it to Luke without a word. The entire transaction took less than 30 seconds, a brief, impersonal exchange that felt monumental. He had just purchased his future. Clutching the ticket, he hurried down the narrow aisle, seeking refuge in the very back of the bus. He sank into a worn vinyl seat next to a large, grimy window. As the bus rumbled back onto the highway, he pressed his face against the cool glass, watching the familiar landscape of Nag's Head begin to slide away. He saw the brightly colored souvenir shops, the towering hotel signs, and the distant, shimmering line of the ocean. It was all receding, shrinking until it was just a memory viewed through a dusty pane of glass. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, a feeling of being untethered from everything he had ever known. He was in motion, hurtling toward an uncertain future, a solitary passenger on a journey with no map and no one waiting for him at the other end. The bus arrived in Cape Hatteras as the afternoon sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. The driver's voice, rough and indifferent, crackled over the intercom, announcing the final stop. Luke's body, which had been coiled with tension for the entire ride, grew even tighter. He gathered his courage and walked to the front of the bus, his footsteps echoing in the near-empty vehicle. He stepped down onto the pavement of a town he had only ever heard as a name in a whispered, cruel conversation. The air here was different, carrying the scent of salt and wild marsh grass. The sounds were muted, the frantic energy of Nag's Head replaced by a quiet, windswept calm. He had made it. He was 53 miles away. He was free. And he was completely, terrifyingly alone. He walked away from the bus stop with no destination in mind, the setting sun casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to chase him down the empty street. The quiet of Cape Hatteras was a stark contrast to the relentless noise of Nag's Head, but it offered no comfort. Here, the silence felt vast and empty, amplifying his solitude. His only instinct was to seek the ocean, the one constant in his life, so he followed the sound of the waves until he reached the towering coastal bluffs. For hours, he walked aimlessly along their edge, a small solitary figure moving against the backdrop of the darkening sky. The adrenaline from his escape had worn off, leaving behind a profound exhaustion and a cold, gnawing fear. He had run as far as his $20 could take him, but now, with the night closing in, he had nowhere left to go, no one to turn to, and no shelter from the coming darkness. As he walked, he watched the tide, a habit ingrained in him by years of living by the sea. He saw it retreat, pulling back from the base of the bluffs with a quiet, sighing sound, revealing a wide stretch of dark, wet rocks and sand that was normally submerged beneath the churning waves. This newly exposed terrain, slick with algae and dotted with tidal pools, seemed like a different world, a secret landscape revealed for only a few hours. The wind picked up, whipping at his thin shirt and chilling him to the bone. He knew he couldn't stay exposed on the bluffs all night. He needed to find a place to hide, a small corner of the world where he could be invisible until the sun came up. A place where he could simply stop moving and breathe without the constant fear of being found and dragged back to the life he had just escaped. It was then that he saw it, a detail so small it was almost lost in the deepening twilight. Between two massive rock formations, partially obscured by a curtain of hanging seaweed, was a narrow fissure, a dark vertical line that seemed to lead directly into the face of the cliff. It was barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Driven by a mix of desperation and a flicker of curiosity, he scrambled down the sandy incline to the rocky shore below. As he drew closer, he could feel a draft of cool, dry air emanating from the opening, a sign that there was a space beyond. It was a risk, a step into a complete unknown, but the alternative was a night spent shivering in the open. Taking a deep breath, he turned sideways and carefully squeezed his small frame through the tight, unforgiving crevice, the rough stones scraping against his clothes. He emerged into a space that stole his breath away. He was standing in a large, dry cave, its high vaulted ceiling lost in the shadows above. The air inside was cool and still, smelling of salt and ancient undisturbed stone. Faint beams of moonlight streamed through several small fissures high in the rock, illuminating the cavern in a soft, ethereal glow. The sound of the wind and waves was instantly muted, replaced by a profound, peaceful silence. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, Luke felt a sense of security wash over him. This place was hidden, secret, a natural fortress carved into the earth. No one would think to look for him here. It was a sanctuary, a temporary haven from the world that had been so relentlessly cruel to him, and the relief was so overwhelming it made his legs feel weak. As his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized this was no ordinary sea cave. The far wall was covered in a vast, intricately painted mural of marine life, the colors still vibrant despite the passage of time. Whales, dolphins, and sea turtles seemed to swim across the stone. Below it, the space was arranged like a meticulously preserved workshop. There were wooden tables holding antique scientific instruments, glass aquariums filled with sand and shells, and clipboards hanging from hooks with detailed hand-drawn sketches of fish. It was a secret laboratory, a handmade marine observatory, frozen in time. The sheer care and passion evident in every corner of the room left him speechless. This was a place built not for function, but for love, a shrine to the wonders of the ocean, preserved in the heart of the rock. This was the moment our story began. His gaze swept across the incredible scene, and that's when he saw it, tucked away on a high, natural ledge near the back of the cave. It was a sturdy, sealed plastic box, the kind designed to be waterproof and airtight. It seemed deliberately placed, secured and protected from the elements. A surge of curiosity, stronger than his fear or his exhaustion, compelled him forward. He dragged a heavy wooden crate across the sandy floor, its legs scraping against the stone, and positioned it beneath the ledge. Climbing onto its unstable surface, he stretched his arms as high as they could go, his fingertips just managing to brush against the cool, smooth plastic of the container. With a final, determined effort, he hooked his fingers over the edge and carefully eased the box down, its weight surprising him as he cradled it in his arms. He sat on the sandy floor, the box resting in his lap, his heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and reverence. For a long moment he just stared at it, running his hands over the sealed lid. This box was a part of the story of this place, a deliberate message left behind by whoever had created this hidden world. His hands, still trembling slightly, worked at the heavy-duty latches on the side of the container. They were stiff from disuse, but with a final, forceful click, they sprang open. He lifted the lid, his breath catching in his throat. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried seaweed and perfectly preserved shells, were several old photographs of a smiling boy who looked to be about his own age, a boy with the same sandy brown hair and bright, curious eyes. And beneath them, there was a single yellowed letter, folded with immense care. He gently lifted the letter from the box, its paper fragile and soft with age. He unfolded it slowly, carefully, as if handling a sacred artifact. The page was filled with elegant, handwritten cursive, the ink slightly faded, but still perfectly legible. His eyes scanned the first few lines, absorbing words of profound love and encouragement. The letter spoke of dreams, of a shared passion for the ocean, and of a bond between a parent and a child that felt as deep and as vast as the sea itself. It was a testament to a kind of love he had only ever experienced in the fading memories of his own parents, a love that nurtured and celebrated, a love that built secret laboratories in caves just to see a child smile. The contrast with his own recent reality was a physical blow, a sudden crushing weight of everything he had lost and everything he had never had. And that is when the carefully constructed walls he had built around his heart for 3 long years finally, completely crumbled. The strength that had carried him through the escape, the focus that had guided his steps, all of it dissolved in the face of this tangible proof of unwavering love. His legs suddenly felt weak, unable to support the weight of his discovery, and he sank fully onto the ground, the letter still clutched in his hand. The silent sobs began as a tremor deep in his chest before they racked his entire body, echoing in the quiet, forgotten laboratory. For the first time since his parents were gone, for the first time in 3 years of silent endurance, Luke Williams allowed himself to cry, not from fear or from pain, but from the overwhelming, heartbreaking beauty of a love he thought had vanished from the world forever. His tears subsided into a profound, aching silence, leaving him hollowed out and strangely calm. He picked up the letter again, his fingers tracing the elegant, looping script, as if to absorb the warmth of the hands that had written it so many years ago. The date at the top of the page was from 1992, a time before he was even born. The letter began with a salutation that felt like a punch to the heart. "My dearest Daniel." It was addressed to a 10-year-old boy on his birthday, written by his parents, Robert and Christina Miller. Each word was imbued with a tenderness that was utterly foreign to Luke's recent life. He read on, his eyes moving slowly across the page, not just reading words, but witnessing an act of pure, unadulterated love, a message in a bottle that had washed up on the shore of his own desolate existence. And he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that this discovery would change everything. The letter explained the origin of the secret place with a beautiful, simple clarity. Robert and Christina wrote about how they had watched their son, Daniel, spend hours on the beach, his pockets always full of shells and his notebooks filled with drawings of crabs and seabirds. They called him their little ocean scientist, a term of endearment that spoke of deep pride and gentle encouragement. They explained that they had spent months secretly preparing the cave, transforming it into his very own marine laboratory, a place where his curiosity could flourish without interruption, a sanctuary built just for him. It was his 10th birthday present, a gift not of money or toys, but of space, of purpose, and of their unwavering belief in his passions. The sheer thoughtfulness of the gesture, the immense effort and love it represented, was almost too much for Luke to comprehend. It was a concept from another universe. As he absorbed the meaning behind the miller's words, his own world came into sharp, painful focus. The contrast was a chasm, an impossible gulf between the life Daniel had lived and the one he was enduring. His own 10th year was not being celebrated with a secret laboratory. It was being spent hauling chairs for tourists under a blistering sun. The only gift he had ever received from his uncle was the bitter lesson that he was a financial burden, a problem to be managed and eventually solved. The idea that an adult could look at a child's passion and decide to build a world around it simply for the joy of seeing that child thrive was so profoundly different from his reality that it felt like a fantasy. He was not a source of pride. He was a source of free labor, his worth measured not in love but in the $150 a month his uncle was about to collect. His gaze lifted from the letter and fell upon the field notebook stacked neatly on one of the wooden tables. He walked over and picked one up, the cover worn smooth with use. He opened it to a random page and saw meticulous, hand-drawn diagrams of tidal patterns, accompanied by notes written in a child's developing script, with corrections and encouraging comments added in the margins by an adult's hand. He saw detailed sketches of different fish species, each one carefully labeled. This was not just a child's hobby, it was a collaborative project, a shared journey of discovery between a son and his parents. Every page was tangible proof of the encouragement Daniel had received, a testament to the time and attention his parents had invested in his dreams. For Luke, who had never once been asked what he was interested in, the notebooks felt like artifacts from a lost civilization. He moved through the cave as if in a dream, his fingers lightly brushing against the other objects. He saw the jars of shells, each one cleaned and catalogued with a small paper label, identifying its species and the date it was found. He saw the framed drawings of sea turtles hanging on the rock wall, signed proudly with the name Daniel Miller, age 9. Everything in the cave, from the antique microscope on the main table to the worn-out reference books on marine life, spoke of a childhood that had been actively nurtured. This was not a space that had been bought. It had been built, piece by piece, with love as the primary material. It was a physical manifestation of a family's bond, a place where a child was not only allowed to have dreams, but was given the tools and the support to chase them with everything he had. Luke finally understood. This cave was more than just an abandoned workshop or a clever hiding place. It was a sanctuary in every sense of the word. It had been created to protect and shelter a young boy's passion from the distractions of the outside world. It was a space where Daniel could be completely himself, celebrated for his unique interests and loved for who he was. And now, by some impossible twist of fate, this same sanctuary was sheltering him, a different boy running from a world that sought to crush his spirit. The cave was a constant, a haven built from love that had endured through the decades, waiting in the silence to offer its protection to another child in desperate need of a safe harbor. A quiet place to believe that a better world was possible. The full weight of the emotional contrast hit him then, a wave of understanding that was both devastating and clarifying. For every hour Daniel had spent in this cave carefully studying the ocean's mysteries, Luke had spent an hour on the hot sand, his muscles aching, his spirit eroding under the weight of his uncle's greed. For every word of encouragement Daniel had read in the margins of his notebooks, Luke had heard the cold, dismissive phrase, "earning his keep," a constant reminder of his status as an unwanted obligation. Daniel's world was one of expansion, of possibility, of adults who saw his potential and invested in it. Luke's world was one of contraction, of servitude, of adults who saw his vulnerability and exploited it. The two realities were so diametrically opposed that they could not coexist in his mind without breaking something open inside of him. But the discovery did more than just highlight the cruelty he had faced. It fundamentally rewired his understanding of the world. For 3 years, his uncle's house had been his only reality, a place where love was transactional and care was conditional. He had started to believe that this was how the world worked, that people were inherently selfish and that he was destined to be alone. But the letter in his hand, the laboratory around him, was undeniable proof to the contrary. It was proof that deep, selfless, unconditional love was real. It existed. Robert and Christina Miller had existed. Their love for their son was not a memory or a story. It was a physical presence in this cave, embedded in the very stones, and it was powerful enough to reach across time and give him a reason to hope. He walked back to the plastic box and gently picked up one of the photographs. It showed a smiling, sandy-haired boy, his arms wrapped around a large sea turtle shell, his eyes bright with excitement. This was Daniel. He was not just a name in a letter anymore. He was a real person, a boy who had stood in this very spot, who had felt the same cool air on his skin and heard the same muted roar of the ocean. Luke felt a strange and powerful kinship with him, a connection that transcended time and circumstance. They were two boys who loved the sea, whose lives had been irrevocably shaped by it. In that moment he did not feel entirely alone. He felt as though he had found a brother he had never known, a friend whose memory was now a quiet companion in the darkness. The tears that came this time were different. They were not the desperate, panicked sobs of a frightened child. They were quiet, born of a profound and complex mixture of grief and gratitude. He wept for the childhood he had lost, for the parents whose love he could only faintly remember. He grieved for Daniel, a boy he would never meet, but whose story had touched him so deeply. But he also cried with a sense of overwhelming gratitude for having found this place, for being shown this beautiful, heartbreaking truth. It was as if the love the Millers had poured into this cave had been stored up for years, waiting for someone to find it, and now it was washing over him, cleansing the wounds of the past 3 years and filling the empty spaces in his heart with a fragile, shimmering light. He carefully placed the letter and the photographs back into the waterproof box, handling them with the reverence of a sacred trust. He closed the lid and clicked the latches shut, a silent promise to protect the legacy he had stumbled upon. This place was no longer just a temporary shelter. It was a sacred ground, a testament to a family's love that had survived even after they were gone. He felt a sudden fierce sense of responsibility to honor their memory, to ensure that the story of Daniel and his secret laboratory was not lost to the tides. For the first time since his parents' accident, he felt a sense of purpose that extended beyond his own survival. He was no longer just a runaway. He was the keeper of a beautiful secret, a guardian of a love story written in shells and stone. The world outside the cave was still a place of uncertainty and danger, but something inside him had fundamentally shifted. The cruelty of his uncle no longer defined the boundaries of his universe. He now had a new reference point, a new North Star to guide him, the unwavering love of Robert and Christina for their son. That love had built a sanctuary powerful enough to last for decades, and its discovery had built a new foundation within him, one made not of fear and resentment, but of hope and the undeniable knowledge that goodness was real. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, or where he would go when the tide came back in, but he knew he would not face it as the same boy who had stumbled into this cave. He was now carrying a light, a memory of a love so strong it could change the world. One small forgotten boy at a time. The arrival of Dr. Christina Taylor was not just a rescue, it was a reckoning. Her call to Child Protective Services set in motion a swift and decisive investigation that unraveled the full extent of Roger Williams' cruelty. The authorities discovered not only the forced labor at the beach shack, but also a deeper, more calculated betrayal. For 3 years, Roger had been embezzling $300 a month from the life insurance policy Luke's parents had established for his education and future. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Roger lost custody immediately, was forced to repay every stolen dollar, and faced a battery of legal charges for child labor exploitation and fraud. For Luke, the transition was surreal. He was gently guided from the quiet sanctuary of the cave into the warm, welcoming home of Christina and her husband, George. A year later, the legal process concluded and they officially adopted him, offering him not just a house, but the one thing he had thought was lost forever, a real family. The cave, once a monument to a private love, was destined for a greater purpose. Together, Luke, Christina, and George decided that its light should not be hidden. They revitalized the secret laboratory, transforming it from a place of memory into a living, breathing educational project they named the Daniel Observatory. It became a tribute not only to the son Christina had lost, but also to the son she had found. The mission was simple, yet profound, to offer free, hands-on marine biology courses to the young people from the local fishing communities, kids who, like Luke, possessed a deep connection to the sea but lacked the resources to explore it. The observatory became a beacon of hope, a place where curiosity was nurtured and potential was celebrated. It was a physical manifestation of the belief that every child deserved a space to dream, a sanctuary built not just of stone, but of shared purpose and a deep, healing love that honored the past by investing in the future. The impact of the Daniel Observatory rippled far beyond the walls of the cave, creating waves of change along the entire coast. As local children and teenagers began attending the free courses, the project became more than an educational center. It became a community hub, a safe space where young people felt seen and heard. Through the trust they built, Christina and George began to notice troubling patterns, hearing quiet stories of hardship that mirrored Luke's own experience. The observatory inadvertently became an early warning system, a place where vulnerability could be safely revealed. In its first 3 years of operation, the connections forged within that small, hidden laboratory led to the identification of 23 other children in situations of neglect or exploitation. The legacy of one family's love had become a powerful tool for justice, proving that a single act of kindness, preserved in a forgotten cave, could grow into a force capable of protecting an entire generation. 4 years after walking out of that cave, Luke was no longer a victim defined by his past, but a young man shaping his future. At 14, he stood as a medalist in the USA Biology Olympiad, his passion for the ocean now honed into a remarkable scientific talent. He spent his weekends at the Daniel Observatory not as a student, but as a mentor, guiding younger children through the same wonders that had once captivated Daniel Miller. He used the knowledge he had gained to multiply the legacy of love he had found preserved in the rock, his own story serving as a quiet testament to the resilience of the human spirit. The scars of his past remained, a reminder of the cruelty he had overcome, but they were no longer the sum of his existence. He was living proof that a refuge created by one family, found by a boy in his darkest hour, could generate waves of transformation capable of saving